Okay, so now we know that these cemeteries all date at least to the 1700s, even the later ones. So these are views of Bethlehem Cemetery. Bethlehem Cemetery was the black cemetery for the western side of Nassau. Pottersfield was the cemetery for whites, particularly whites who were not Anglican, on the western side of Nassau. Because if you were Anglican and you were on the western side of Nassau, you probably would have been buried in Christ Church's cemetery. But if you were not Anglican, they would happily put you in Pottersfield. If you were black, you would go in Bethlehem. And they're close by. Now, this cemetery had some issues. It went through some changes in the early 20th century. That's why you see the pavilion, the playground equipment. I used to play in these. I used to swing in these swings, eat tamarind leaves off these trees. Sometime about 7-8 years ago, someone in the community, ignorance is not bliss, especially when you're dealing with historical details. Ignorance is so not bliss. Someone in the community felt they were doing a community service, and because I was passing on a bus, I was passing on Meeting Street and almost fell off my seat. But there was a bobcat machine in there digging up graves. These two graves here, I don't remember seeing them. These would be some of the simpler graves. They're curved, but that's cut stone. They may have had wooden head pieces originally, but they're definitely graves. I don't remember seeing them. This one is the last remaining legible gravestone in there. This stone, we believe, was too heavy for the bobcat. This is granite. Originally, some people we were working with thought it was broken, but this isn't broken, it's just disassembled. This is granite. It would have been made in these segments for ease of transport and shipping, because these are solid chunks of granite. So they're heavy. But this gravestone is a monument for Mr. Alexander Bain. And this site, the Bethlehem site, there are plans afoot now. The Antiquities Corporation, where I work, cooperated with the Ministry of Works and Reverend C.B. Moss and his Bain and Grantstown Association to eventually remove the pavilion. I think the pavilion is going, but definitely the playground equipment is going to be removed. Sometime in the early 20th century, probably before 1920, this cemetery, this historic cemetery that was already over 100 years old, was turned into a park. Who knows? But it was already closed as a cemetery by then. And in doing the research when when this site is reverted to an historic cemetery site, and to be able to explain on signage what you're looking at, it's believed that Alexander Bain is the Mr. Bain that Baintown is named after. Prior to this research, the understanding was that Baintown was named after a Mr. Bain who bought a whole chunk of property and sold it to free blacks shortly after emancipation and liberated Africans, and so they named it after him. That's really not quite so. That's not supported by the documentation. Alexander Bain was mulatto. His father was also Alexander Bain, but his father came to the Bahamas. His father married a white Bahamian woman, but apparently she died. It doesn't seem that they had any children together, but his father was a lawyer. And sometime after, it's presumed that his first wife died, that Alexander Bain had a child by a free black woman, and that child was this Alexander Bain. He was born in 1812 and died in like 1791 or 92. So he was fairly old when he died. But he had spent all his life living in this area. When he died in the 1890s, he lived on the northern end of Augusta Street, closer to Bay Street. But he was wealthy. He lived in this neighborhood all his life, and he was Mr. Bain. So who do you think the Bain is they would name Bain Town after? Not the other possible candidate was a Charles Bain, who started life as a slave. He was born in about 1826, and he also died in the 1870s or 90s. And for someone who died as a slave, by the time he died, he owned property, and because of the amount of property he owned, he almost certainly could vote. That was quite an accomplishment for someone who was born a slave. But when you put him up against this Mr. Bain as the more likely candidate that Bain's Town was named after, I suspect it's this Mr. Bain. And the property was not bought up by one person and sold to a number of people. Bethlehem Cemetery was situated at this point on the western edge of Nassau because there was already an unofficial black community at the southern side of the hill atop which Government House stands. And that area we still know today as Over the Hill. Later, they were formally laid out as Grantstown and Bainstown. But the reason why Bethlehem Cemetery is located here, because black people live nearby. Another thing in the research, when I was doing my doctoral research, I used this as, when I started out, I didn't know as much as I know now about the other cemetery. I'll come to that next. But I was using this as a contemporary site for comparison with the one on the eastern side of town, because they were dedicated at the same time. The records from the dedication said that they were dedicated in 1824, 1826, but in the 1820s. And in the records it said all of these, including the white cemeteries, they were in use for at least 30 years prior to their dedication. So that would mean the 1790s that they were in use. Originally, I was thinking this was contemporary with the other one, but we'll see some more details about the other cemetery when I move on to that. But these trees here, this is at least 2 or 3 tamarind trees. This is a woman town. That's a woman town there. And there's another view looking back this way. There is a woman town back this way. For black cemeteries in the Bahamas, historically, these trees are not simply landscaping. These were grave markers. They would have been planted at the head of a grave. The other view that I have of Bethlehem shows these trees at the head of very expensive tombs that, except for the tree, you would think this was a white cemetery. It means that the community that developed on the western side of Nassau, even though these were black people, they were very diverse economically. They were not all poor people. They were not all former slaves. Some of them were free people, like Alexander Bain. For his birth record, he was listed as a free mulatto when he was born, and his father was wealthy. It seems he was his father's only child. He wasn't the only one in Baintown like that. You had a number of people who were buried in this cemetery who had legible gravestones, who had expensive tombs of the period. His, ironically or providentially, happens to be the last legible gravestone left at this site. But before I move on, I wanted to make a note that the tamarind trees and the Womantown trees in this cemetery are a specific landscaping feature of African descended or African influenced cemeteries for the Bahamas, but you would see similarities anywhere in the Americas. The Point Savannah trees, not so much. And from the records, from the description, because the consecration records gives the dimensions of the cemetery, they mention a vacant lot immediately east of it. That is where St. John's Church was built. And St. John's Church goes there 1835. So that goes there about 60 years, 40 to 50 years after the cemetery was started. It seems this school would have been put there in the early 1900s. The school was built on a part of the cemetery because its north-south dimensions are about double what they are now. I'd like to hope they didn't build it over existing graves. Maybe it was an unused portion of the cemetery. Maybe. Okay. So now, this is the other one. This is the cemetery on the eastern side of Nassau. This cemetery illustrates some features of African burial customs that Bethlehem Cemetery doesn't come close to. Bethlehem only has the trees and some artifacts. There's been no archaeological excavations there. But this one has been excavated because I needed to know more details about it. Okay, so this one. Here in the top corner, these lines you see in the sand, these are slats from a coffin. This was the eastern edge of a burial. This is the seawater seeping to the surface. This is less than a meter below the surface. This is at about a little more than 60 centimeters below the surface. And this very light sand here, in archaeology, this is what we call sterile sand. The darker sand means it's been disturbed. You see some interaction. It's had some cultural use. This is sterile sand. So when this person was buried, they were buried probably in water. One of the landscape features I was looking at for this cemetery that I was expecting, I was wanting to understand what would be some of the landscape treatments that people of African descent would use in their cemeteries that you shouldn't see in a European descended cemetery, like Center Burial Ground that's literally across the street. One of the key features is that African descended people, when they maintain their African cultural outlook, prefer to have their burials in or near water, because the belief all over West Africa and probably much East Africa as well, the belief is that water is the transition, the medium of transition between the physical and the spiritual world. So if you cannot physically be at the water's edge, you want water somewhere near there. So this is one feature. Next here, this is a little lower. Where you see this water here, again, this is water seeping to the surface. This is about 80 centimeters below the surface. Again, this is less than a meter below the current surface of the ground. These are hand-carved limestone footstones. So these were at least 2 burials here. And again, you have them in water, because these are African descended people. They like that. For European descended people, this would be a disaster. This would be a nightmare. Now, let me deal with this one first, then I'll come back to this one.